Good afternoon. My name's Andrew Murtha, and I'm the George and Sadie Hyman Professor of China Studies here at Johns Hopkins SAIS. Before we begin, I want to thank Reed Cullen and her team, without whom none of this would have been possible. Politics and Prose, who will be selling copies of Mike's terrific new book. And of course, I want to thank all of you for being here from Dean Steinberg on down. So thank you all very much for being here. David, Mike, Lampton needs no introduction, especially to this audience, so I'll try to keep this short. We know of Mike's distinguished career as a scholar at Ohio State University and here at SAIS. His work continues to inform the study of China across a dizzying number of dimensions. I think it's safe to say that Mike is the only person who has published in the APSR, the China Quarterly, and the American Journal of Tropical Medicine and Hygiene. Mike's tenure as president of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations was instrumental in helping guide the bilateral relationship in the fraught post-Tiananmen decade. His work on all manner of Track 2 dialogues, congressional appearances, on NGO boards, and so on, has created much of the vocabulary of best practices with regards to managing the U.S.-China relationship. Although scrupulously polite and diplomatic, Mike is not a wallflower or a backbencher. His visibility is something that we have reassuringly been able to take for granted. So it comes as quite a surprise to read his wonderful new book, Living U.S.-China Relations, and learn so much more about Mike's extraordinarily rich life than was previously known to me, and I would suspect many of you. Two possible exceptions are his wife, Susan, and his copy editor and longtime collaborator, Dr. Ann Thurston, both of whom are here today. Mike expressly vetoed today's event as any sort of a celebration. Rather, what he envisioned was a discussion of his life so far, as documented in Living U.S.-China Relations, as a roundtable chat with three of his colleagues, whose work was shaped to a considerable degree by Mike. We will then open it up to a larger conversation with the audience. Among the panelists, David Bullman is a former student of Mike's and is the Jill McGovern and Steve Muller Assistant Professor of China Studies and International Affairs, and a valued colleague. Dr. Carla Freeman studied under and worked alongside Mike for many years. She is a senior China expert at the U.S. Institute for Peace and is herself an institution. I was deeply influenced by Mike's earlier work on policymaking and policy implementation long before I ever met him. He has been a generous and insightful colleague ever since. For credibility and balance, I tried to find somebody who may have had anything other than a stellar assessment of Mike's character, anybody who might be able to say something negative. It proved to be impossible. The worst thing that anybody could recall was an instance when Mike cheerily excused himself from a group of other scholars because his accumulated airline miles gave him access to a nicer airport business lounge than they had access to. Before we start the conversation, Mike will say a few words, so without any further ado, let me introduce a mentor, colleague, and friend to so many of us, Mike Lampton.
I can't tell you how great it is to be back at SAIS and see all you, particularly students, I really miss students. So, any case, and to see you in this wonderful school, how lucky. Let's hope we can translate this into a better world outside. But in any case, I want to thank Dean Steinberg for the honor of coming and to see you again, all my colleagues. I want to emphasize the role that Ann Thurston played. You write a memoir, as one agent I went to in New York says, memoir, but you're not Prince Harry. right? So there's a lot of self-doubt. Who's going to be interested here? Ann Thurston, at every stage, along with my wife, encouraged me. And so in any case, I want to thank her. And if there's any graceful prose in it, you can probably trace it to Ann's contributions. I also want to thank Andy and Carla and David for taking their time to read thoroughly the book and be able to comment on it and so forth. And I also want to acknowledge Madeline Ross, who, as I was leaving SAIS, kept the ship moving ahead and has just been such a great colleague, not only here, but throughout the years when she first started at the U.S.-China Business Council. I'm often asked why I wrote this book, and I usually say, and genuinely so, that you don't do a book for just one reason, usually. You've got several reasons. One is personal. It was my COVID year project. In fact, more than COVID year, four-year project. But certainly that's part of it. But you find in your career that you go through your life busily just chipping away at your life task without quite realizing how you got into it, why you are where you are now, and what does it all add up to. So that was a bundle of purposes. Also, of course, there was the long-term objective of trying to contribute to something I've spent my whole life trying to do, is build mutual understanding between the United States, China, and indeed the Western world, more broadly speaking. Also, there was what you might call academic methodological. It just so happened, and luck, careers are a huge amount of luck, or serendipity. But in any case, I had the opportunity to observe the U.S.-China relations at the international level, the national level, the governor's level, province, state level, NGO, and individual level. And I thought I had an exposure to those multiple levels that gave me an insight that I think is important in my third purpose, which was policy-oriented. We conceive of U.S.-China relations often as a state-to-state relationship. But engagement, particularly, but I believe the stage going into the engagement period and whatever stage you want to consider us in now, is really, we're better understood as a society-to-society relationship. And this relationship to be managed has to be managed effectively at all of those various levels. So this is really about that. In putting it in the parlance of the building that way and the building that way, the policy community, the sort of storyline is that engagement was built on a misconception that somehow by the mere act of engagement, the political system of China was going to change in ways that would be more congenial to us. And in some sense, I can see that. But I think it's better understood as Nixon and Mao and Carter and Brzezinski and Deng Xiaoping pushed a snowball down the hill. And it began to gather, and pretty soon this relationship was on automatic pilot with every different interest group in our society seeing an interest. Universities, it might be tuition-paying students. It may be good research assistants, great brains. If you were in the business world, almost self-evident with the growth in China, that where interests lie. When we were worried about the Soviet Union, China seemed to have strategic benefits to us. But what happened is every different interest group in this society saw a reason to interact with China, and on balance, for about 30 to 40 years, that was positive. But in the process, as those common interests were fulfilled, there was a lot of damage in both of our societies. There were people and groups that saw themselves as losers. And they began to accumulate, and pretty soon the balance of power, political power, in both of our societies. This was true in China too. There were losers in globalization in China. And so really what this is about how that snowball went down the hill. This wasn't because of China scholars. It wasn't even because of the Brzezinskis and the equivalents in China. It was because millions of people and groups saw interest. I remember early on, Father Hesburgh, president of Notre Dame. Why was he an enthusiast of engagement? Because it was a Christian duty to improve relations with a quarter of the world's people. That was compelling for him, right? So, long and the short of it is, I hope this gives a texture and feeling to engagement. It wasn't a strategy. It wasn't a plan. It was a happening. And I just happened to be in a place where I think I could see it. And I tried to provide some personal observations in various domains that I think maybe make that case. So thank you very much for coming. It's heartening to see. Great to see my old students and my colleagues. And I look forward to the discussion.
Okay, before we get started, I forgot to mention, I think, that there will be copies of the book for sale afterwards, and an autographed version of that will probably fetch a fair amount down the road. So just, what I thought we would do is just go kind of in order, a few rounds, and then depending on kind of how far we get, or we can, at some point, we will open it up for audience questions as well. Why don't I ask I was thinking about this more in terms of this is your life, and so I had one of the things that really struck me is, you know, the question for those of us who do what we do is, what first got you interested? What was the first, but there's a question that comes even before that you kind of get at in the book, which is where you grew up, particularly California. You spend a fair amount of time in the first part of the book where it's almost a character in itself in terms of kind of the orientation of and how growing up in California was something that was a kind of a part of what got you interested in and kept your interest in kind of looking eastward. And so as somebody who grew up on the other coast, I found it particularly fascinating. I thought it may be a good place to start.
Well, to the story, California is a state of mind. It certainly was in the 1950s. Young families moved from across the continent and came to California. And so it was a very forward-looking place. It looked at Atlanticism and the Atlantic as yesterday's story. This was widely shared view. It was the future, particularly for the right in California. It's no accident that Ronald Reagan and Richard Nixon and so associated with positive movement, basically, in U.S.-China relations, came from California. The idea was that China was really the economic future, and if we could help make China democratic in a way, that would foster peace, it would oppose the Soviet Union, and it would be the natural market towards which the West was facing. And my wife Susan's uncle worked for Pacific Airlines, owned by the Alioto family, and he was mayor of San Francisco. They called him Mafia Joe, but in any case, and Ronald Reagan, he was on television, and he was originally a Democrat, but became a Republican, pushing the idea that liberalization in China would be important to the West. He had a TV program, Death Valley Days, that I grew up with. Richard Nixon landed in my baseball field, held up his V sign. And in later life, I recount meeting him and talking about that. He rose to national power as an anti-communist, but in the 60s concluded that that the United States needed to get strategic leverage and that China might help at that. So I grew up in this. I think many people who know me now would be surprised to find that I escorted Barry Goldwater to the dais at $100 a plate dinner. And one of the first books I read of a political nature was his Conscience of a Conservative. So California was very Pacific oriented. And then, of course, I went to Stanford, and there's Leland Stanford and the building of the Transcontinental Railroad and that opening to the Pacific. It was really the launching pad for Pacific projection of American economic and military power. So to me, California just gave me an Asia focus. It was all around me. My wife's uncle adopted basically a Chinese lifestyle, and his whole library, which was enormous, was all about China. So it just kind of happened naturally to me.
Let me just ask a follow-up, just to cover this part of the book and of your story. You have two mentors that you mentioned throughout the book, John Lewis and Mike Oxenberg. And I'm wondering how did they shape how you see China and how you approach China? And what advice did they give you that you would or wouldn't give students today?
Right. Actually, I give pride of place in terms of mentors to my high school teacher, Miss Turner. And I, in fact, entitled one of the chapters, "It's Miss Turner." She came in the first day of class and said, "It's Miss Turner, and I like it that way." That was her signature sign-on. And but in any case, she basically had a view that China and Asia had deep, rich civilizations that had their own distinctive goals, their own distinctive social structure, values, and that they were finding difficulty reconciling the need for the technology and things of the West without becoming the West. And that they had a legitimate nationalism. They wanted pride and dignity in the world and were struggling for ways to get it. And that the West was in some ambivalent way a solution to their problem, but also the problem. And this is, of course, contrasted with, I mentioned Barry Goldwater. They weren't thinking in those terms. So much of what I was hearing out of the political side of living in California, she was saying it's a lot more complicated than that. And she went out, the U.S. Congress passed a bill to establish the East-West Center, I believe in 1960. I was in her class in 1964. And she was one of the first people to go out to the East-West Center in the summers and come back and regale her students with stories of Asia, the East-West Center, what exciting things were going on. And So she got me very interested. And so then when I went to Stanford, I ran into Mike Oxenberg. The demand for China knowledge was going up very rapidly. He hadn't even finished his dissertation, and he was teaching at Stanford. Pretty much would be unheard of now. But in any case, and he was a young man that just was full of ideas. He had more ideas in a day than most of us have in years or a career. But he was working on water conservancy, you know. Agriculture is important in China. Water is important to everywhere. There's great politics. There's a great literature. There's comparativism. And so he opened me up to, you can understand societies not always by looking at the Politburo, the White House, or the Capitol Hill, but why don't you get down in the weeds where the rubber meets the road for people in daily life and learn something about that. That fit with my whole ethos. And when I mentioned I had policy or academic purposes, one of them was to explore the utility of talking to people in China to find out how China works, you know? Yes, I use documents. Yes, I use data sets, of course. But in the end, politics is about how people perceive things. So Oxenberg plugged me into that. He always told a story that, and it's true, I came into his office one day. Stanford, those of you know, have these beautiful sandstone inner core of buildings. I mean, it's, to my mind, the most beautiful campus there. So that one sunny day I came and I said to him, I don't know what I'm going to do with my life. And he says, well, why don't you study China? And I said, okay. So he always told that. He couldn't believe it. But that's exactly what happened. Now, it was all, the soil was there. He didn't convince me. He just liberated me to say it. So that was very important. But then he left Stanford, and I went into the Army, and when I came back, I didn't want to go to Columbia where he had gone. So I happened to find John Lewis, who had got his PhD at UCLA, but wrote a well-known book of the era called Leadership in Communist China. And he basically was himself a dynamo, but he had a big project on a particular place in China called Tangshan in Hebei, and the place where that big 76 earthquake happened. And all the graduate students were going to into that project. No, I shouldn't say all, a lot. But I wasn't interested in that. That just didn't turn me on, and I wondered what to do. And so I didn't want to tell him I wasn't interested in his project. So I went in one day and said, you know, John, or Professor Lewis at that time, I'm not prepared to do that, but what I really like to do is study the delivery of medicine in China. And he said, you know, that's a great idea. And so what he really did for me, but beyond intellectual frameworks, is essentially liberate me to follow my own substantive interest. And I think that's the story. Teaching is more, I think, about inspiration. Let people find their interests and give them enough tools to explore it, right? And so all three of those people really did that. And I've always appreciated teaching as really a noble enterprise.
Is that good? I'm very glad you went to teaching because that's where I was going to jump in. But I feel like I know I'm supposed to ask a question immediately, but I can't be up here without gushing a bit first or having some mushy gratitude because it's a real honor to be up here. Last week, I took a group of SAIS students to China. And on the trip, one of the students, Zhu Yuan, circulated a list from the Waijiao Xueyuan of the top 20 scholars of China from America. And on that list were Carla and Andy, and at number 1, you, Mike. So it was great to see. Also a reason that I should probably not be saying as much up here, because I was definitely not on the list. You were my SAIS colleague very briefly, but much more importantly, you were my teacher, my PhD advisor. I'm glad you brought up Miss Turner. I had already marked some of the stuff you wrote about Miss Turner, and also about what you wrote about teaching, right? When you wrote about your desire to come back to SAIS, or come to SAIS after the National Committee, you wrote that you wanted to empower students with the concepts and historical background that would enable them to adapt to ever-changing and unforeseen circumstances. I wanted to kindle in younger people a sense of possibilities. Teaching is not simply about facts and concepts. It is about inspiration, motivation, and vision of alternative futures. And I just wanted to say thank you. You did more than that for me. And I think most importantly, you accomplished all of that, but really you taught me and many of my classmates how to effectively conduct ourselves to get the most out of interviews and fieldwork and engagement with other people. And this book is so much about your engagement with other people and engagement with Chinese interlocutors. So thank you for that. I couldn't have asked for more. And on this recent trip, just to bring it back to that, as myself in a leadership position on so many meetings, I always found myself thinking, what would Mike do? So that was a guiding force. This really comes out in the book. It shows how much you affected U.S.-China relations and how much U.S.-China relations affected you, and that sort of that feedback in a sense. And the book is, of course, beautifully written, maybe with thanks to Ann Thurston, but I'm sure on your own as well. And it provides so many excellent stories for understanding the bilateral relationship in a memorable way that we were all able to learn about this. And you can also learn about firefighting and water management and health policy delivery. You can learn about the personalities of Zhu Rongji and Nancy Pelosi, and so much comes out in the book. So there's really never a dull moment. I can't believe you've done this much. All right, so moving on to questions then. I guess my first question comes from what you just said about the importance of talking to people. So the book has so many great cases of people that you've interacted with over many decades. There's not a broad takeaway on how those interactions have changed based on the nature of policymakers in China and what they're willing to say to you in formal or informal meetings and discussions. And I guess I wonder if do you see an evolution? And if you do, in terms of the access, the frankness with which people talk to you, do you see that as coming in the 2000s when Xi Jinping came? I wonder how you see this. There's a piece in here where you relate the conversation you had with a foreign ministry employee during the Taiwan Straits crisis, which is just extremely open and frank. Yeah. And I wonder if that sort of conversation still happens.
The answer is no. But it's not 0 or 100. It's somewhere, invariably, depending on how long you've known somebody, in what secure or not so secure environment you're talking. But clearly, the degree of candor and openness have gone down. You got a lot more body language. Like you start to develop a sentence, and somebody's giving you some body language, maybe take this a little different direction and so on. So as much as I wish I could say no, once you make friends, you're on the consistent channel. I don't think that's generally true. But the longer you've known somebody and the higher the trust, the greater the candor even now. That's been my experience. But we have a lot of things operating here. I mean, we had 2+ years of COVID, which we'll just say, in a sense, wasn't a political happening. It was no travel happening, right? So we've had some confounding developments here, but they've all pushed towards closure. But I wanted to just sort of relay an anecdote that I think really speaks for how we look at China and how sophisticated or not some of the views are there. I spent some time with Zhu Rongji, about 3 weeks almost, traveling to 11 cities and areas in the United States in 1990, shortly after 1989, June 4th. And his purpose coming with 6 mayors of big cities in China was to reopen the dialogue, and our committee could do it because we weren't the government, and our government had said, we're not talking to anybody, a minister and above. And it's pretty hard to solve a problem with a government you won't talk to all the decision makers. It was, and George Herbert Walker Bush, who made that decision after June 4th, knew he made a mistake, and he was glad to see our private organization rescue him in a sense. That's my interpretation. So anyway, this mayor's group shows up in July of 1990, and because I was the head of the greeting party at JFK, I rode in the limo to New York City with him. Now, you know, I'm just a lowly professor in a sense, and here I am in the back seat and no intervention. And we came up over the rise coming from JFK and saw the Twin Towers at that time. We saw, you know, the Chrysler Building, City Core, classic. And I just wondered what Zhu Rongji would think about that. So I just, which is not my nature, shut up for a while. And then he finally said, tell me something. You have something called the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey here. What is it? Why was it built? I mean, he's at this time mayor of Shanghai. And I said, it's a multi-jurisdiction, multi-state, county planning organization to build infrastructure and connectivity in this interdependent city, but not all under one administration. And you need to raise taxes and revenue, and you need to develop interconnectivity through coordination. And he said, you know, that's interesting. We're capitalists. We believe in planning. Or I mean, we're communists and believe in planning. But you're capitalists and you need planning too. And he says, you know, but you believe in the market. We need more market. You know, in the end, we're all mixed economies. We're striving for the right balance. And this idea that we could have, you know, we have the same problems. We don't always come at them from exactly the same starting point. But it's so much easier to communicate when you say, yeah, we got a common problem, we don't necessarily come at it the same way. And that, he was the most modern political leader I ever met in China. And there were a lot, but he was far and away. But I think, you know, interacting with people, they're more complicated than all our caricatures. And, you know, even today where we sort of got one wanted poster in our mental image, a pantheon of Chinese leaders, there are many leaders in China today that have rather different predilections. Not all absolutely congenial to us, for sure. But that's why I've always tried to, let's try to humanize this thing.
Well, I'm so happy to be here to congratulate you, Mike, and also to celebrate this wonderful book. I found it engrossing, not only because of the story that it tells about China, but also we worked together very, very closely for a long time. But we worked very hard, and we didn't have a lot of personal conversations. In fact, I learned from you that you can write books and articles while teaching 4 courses, running a department, and serving as dean of faculty. And I would walk into your office, and I always felt bad because you were in the middle of a sentence, but you would always turn and talk to me about work matters and then go back to writing. It was quite extraordinary. But anyway, I didn't get to learn a lot about your past. And so I was engrossed reading about Mike's childhood in California and your very rich dinner table conversations and about Miss Turner. But of course, the other part of the book that I loved, and colleagues here have already referred to this, is that the broad strokes of the story are really familiar to me. I mean, I've spent a lot of my life living alongside the U.S.-China relationship. But what you took me into was, again, the conversations. It's full of conversations with leaders, people on both sides of the relationship who were able to shape the relationship and make difficult choices, but how to maximize their national interests and minimize the challenges that the relationship has always had from the beginning. And I found that really wonderful to be. You took us into the room with many, many, many top leaders, and so this is the work, not unsurprisingly, of an optimist. I think it comes through someone who believes that people are capable of reason and making rational choices, and that is really, I think, important to remind us that it's possible to manage differences and to keep what you describe as to prevent. I think you're quoting someone here. You'll have to tell me who. To prevent fear. Maybe Nixon said this. To prevent fear from outweighing hope. Yes.
Yeah, I actually gave a talk called "The Tipping Point" at the Carter Center, and I said where the tipping point is where our fears begin to outweigh our hopes.
That's the quote. Yes, I remember that. That was 2015. I have many questions, but I thought maybe rather than take us too far forward, I'd just ask you to tell us about Wuhan. I had the pleasure of traveling with you there in 2009 with a team of students, and I think Professor Bullman might have been along on that, right? Not on that one, okay. But I know Wuhan was so important to you, and I wondered how it shaped your approach to China. If you'd spent that time in Beijing, probably you might have had a very different view of China. What do you think? How do you think Wuhan affected the way you have approached thinking about China?
Well, I started my academic career at Ohio State, and when you landed then in 1974 at the airport, it was basically a cow pasture with an airstrip, and when you got out of the plane, the first sign you encountered is "Welcome to the All-American City," and they at that time had a very conservative Republican governor. His name was James A. Rhodes, one of the most successful, well, probably the most successful governor of Ohio in the 20th century. He got elected to 2 consecutive terms and then 2 more consecutive terms. So in any case, Wuhan and Hubei established a relationship, a state-to-state relationship, one of the earliest. I think Maryland may have been a little earlier, but Ohio and Maryland did this. And the rationale between pairing Ohio and Hubei was they're both in the center of the country. They both have industrial and agricultural industries. They both have big, heavy manufacturing. In other words, they're kind of symmetrical. And we knew sufficiently little about each other that was a compelling reason to establish a relationship in 1970s. And one of the things Hubei wanted to do, where Wuhan's the provincial capital, is establish relationship with Ohio State. And this shows the advantage of not having been, there aren't a lot in academia. You might in many regards want to be at some other coastal university. But there weren't many people studying China in Ohio when I was there. And therefore, when the governor had to call somebody to talk about establishing this relationship, he was driven to me, right? Which in any other dimension wouldn't have been the case. So I had to, from very early on, was playing a role in establishing particularly the academic relationship between the state of Ohio and Wuhan. And so I was predisposed to see the similarities between our two places. And what I saw was people in the Midwest, Ohio, kind of conceive of themselves as what is commonly called the flyover people. All the businesses going on in power and finance in the coastal cities, and we write the checks and mail them to New York is sort of their feeling. And what I found in Hubei was people in the center of China look at Beijing and the big coastal cities like Shanghai the same way, kind of alienated. Populism in the center of both of our countries. So what struck me was, again, the similarities. We spend so much time thinking about how China's different, but in this important way, we actually have the similar kind of social divisions. And then I'll just give one other thing about about Hubei. One thing that left me with a deep impression. I was studying water conservancy. And of course, the Yangtze River flows through Hubei. The Han River dumps in at Wuhan. So there's two rivers intersect. And in any case, the water conservancy infrastructure, the equivalent of the Tennessee Valley Authority, is there. So it's a wonderful place. And so it's an interesting story how I was approved there. Because I was studying water conservancy, there's a Ministry of Electric Power, and water conservancy and electric power. And then I had to have the education ministry. Well, as it turns out, both those ministries had to approve little old me's project. And what are the odds that two big ministries in Beijing are going to approve me for field research in 1982 out in China's countryside, wandering around? Well, as it turns out, the Vice Minister of Education was married to the Minister of Water Conservancy. And he came up to me at a reception at the National Academy of Sciences and said, "You might be interested in how your project got approved." And he said, "We took care of the problem at home." And I said, "You mean this was pillow talk?" Anyway, it was the fastest approval anybody ever saw. That's a very human, it doesn't require a lot of explanation, right? So this is the China I've seen where the resonances are, it's not just about conflict. You know, this is the boxing ring here in Washington for the relationship. But there are lots of other arenas, and most of them can be much more cooperative. So that just one last thing. I was taken up to the far end of Hubei, up by Henan province, a big reservoir called Danjiangkou. And it was a big project started in the late 50s in China. Not very well built, but the point is they couldn't get the dam built to the desired height because the peasants wouldn't move off the land. And I have a picture in the book that show peasants in their little huts like they're floating on the water. They raised the water as far as they could and stopped because the peasants wouldn't move. And I said to myself, what kind of autocracy, what kind of totalitarian, what kind of tough government can't move a few peasants off the land? How is that possible? A big state project important to flood control, electric power generation, the cities downstream, and they can't move a few peasants off? Well, they explained it. In fact, not only is it hard to move them, some people we've paid 3 times to move away. They take the money and they come back. You know, so it got me sort of acclimated to the idea that, yes, the Chinese, from the point of view of the individual, can really crush you if you get in their sights, no doubt. But in many domains, the government is quite constrained, whether it's dealing with citizens, bureaucracies, provinces. So that whole Wuhan, Hubei, 1982, was not a liberal time in China, but it was one in which it was a much more human place than it looked from reading People's Daily.
So I think maybe we'll do one more round, and then we'll open it up to the audience. I wanted to go back just a few years, before the Water Conservancy project, to your first trip to China. And you had mentioned photographs. One of the things about the book is it's full of these wonderful photographs that Mike took over the years. And I remember you said the story about this old man that you bumped into in a hutong in Beijing when you were on your first trip to China, and it had something to do with dirt. And in the photograph, we actually see the dirt that you all were talking about, which was wonderful. But that was a particularly auspicious time to be in China. So the month after Mao died, where nobody was really sure what was going on, including your interlocutors. It's with the benefit of history and hindsight, you can get a sense of, well, that was this is a momentous time. But while you were there, how did you process this big unknown that you were in the middle of?
Well, as a little background, I had written my dissertation, and it became my first book on the politics of medicine in China. And then after my Wuhan, I'd written that book on the politics of medicine. And the National Academy of Sciences was organizing in 1976 a group on steroid chemistry being the active ingredient in birth control pills. And the Chinese, of course, under Mao, had generally subscribed to the notion the more people you have, the more powerful the nation is. And of course, Deng came along and said not exactly, and implemented the one-child policy. And of course, now we have a pronatalist policy again. So birth control policy in China is really interesting. But anyway, because I'd written my dissertation, serendipity, this steroid chemistry group, the National Academy of Sciences, always wanted a substantive China type to go along, so we would get access to China as China got access to our science. It was a bargain. You, China, want science, we want humanities and social science. You've got to accept some of our people if we're going to take unknown large numbers of your people, basically. So I was put on the delegation, and interestingly, the name list went over for approval from the foreign ministry, and they put a red line right through my name. They were all steroid chemists, no problem, but what's this political scientist China type doing on the list? And I was so impressed, the scientists reacted on the group. These are global names. And I'm just finished my dissertation, my first job at Ohio State. And they said, if Lampton doesn't go, nobody's going. And the Chinese, in a flash, figuratively speaking, erased that. So we were just ready to go, and Mao died, and they shut down China for foreign entry for 30 days. But in a few days after Mao's death, the telegram came back, you're welcome on the first day we reopen. And so we landed in China on October 10th, 1976. First day, Mao died September 9th, 1976. And so we entered China. China did not know who its leader was then. You got downtown, and what was happening is troops in formation were running down Chang'an-jie at double time. And then there were these characters on the vermilion walls of the Gugong saying, love the army. Of course, I was trained, whatever you read, flip it over. Why are they saying love the army? Does this mean somebody doesn't love the army in China? So the Chinese really didn't know what to do with us. And what became very clear is it took them about 11 days when we were there to announce who the leader of China was. And it was a guy named Hua Guofeng. And I remember talking to the cadre that picked me up, and Jimmy Carter was running for president at the same time. And he said, who is this guy Jimmy Carter? And I said, well, he's a Southern governor. We don't know too much about him in the U.S. It's sort of like here. we don't know any more about Jimmy Carter in a way that you know about Hua Guofeng. And so we were both kind of in this limbo state of mind about who and what political change was in the offing in both of our societies. I'll just give one anecdote because I think it's so revealing. Finally, they got a little worried about our security, I think, in Beijing. So they flew us without any notice down to the exact, as close to Vietnam as you could get, practically, Guilin, tourist area. Get these foreigners as far away from Beijing as possible. And they kept us down there for several days. And in fact, the young lady that was our guide taking us through caves, they didn't know what to do with us. She welcomed, because she spoke in Chinese, didn't speak English. She welcomed her Japanese visitors, right? So this was a kind of indication they hadn't seen many foreigners here in any case. But then we went into Shanghai, and Shanghai, it had been announced who the leaders of China were, who were the targets of the big gang of four and the little gang of four. There were two gangs of four at least. And Shanghai, as far as up the walls, big character posters denouncing the Gang of Four, Mao's real successors. And the military, the Navy, in the case of Shanghai, was out in the streets. And it was like, I always imagined my father, which I describe in the book, was in Europe. It was like the liberation of Paris from the Nazis. And so in any case, we saw China emerge from this decade through this uncertainty to this jubilation. And so in any case, I'll never forget that. But that's why I've always, I suppose, been relatively patient. That was my baseline to see China. Everything practically has been uphill, or up from there, right? It's sort of, if your first exposure to China was in 1990, things don't look so rosy. If your baseline's 1976 and China doesn't even know who its leader is, and everybody's afraid to talk to you about what they might think, well, then you've got a different baseline. So I think that it doesn't mean I'm right. Everybody's got their baseline. You just need to understand mine if you want to understand me.
Well, I have lots of policy-related questions that this book inspired me to think about public opinion, about overestimating and underestimating China, and all sorts of things that I hope I can follow up with you on. But since you're here and we have a lot of students here, and I was able to benefit from your advice, at the end of the book, you write that each preceding cyclical upswing creates the human infrastructure that will facilitate the future upswing when the time is propitious. A very optimistic take, I think, that I think Carl has already noted you have an eternal optimism that's very infectious. But I guess, obviously right now, the book is from Cold War to Cold War. We're back in the Cold War. Times are not as easy to research China, to study China. So many of my students are finding jobs that might only be available in security-related fields and focusing on China. They worry about going to China to study Chinese and to even go on student trips to China. So I guess I wonder what advice you have for all the students we have out here in terms of navigating, studying China now, how that advice, if it has changed since you gave me so much advice however many years ago.
Well, I wouldn't underestimate the challenges. So, I am optimistic strategically. And the reason I said there's cycle, but eventually the talent and knowledge we're developing now will have its utility. And what I have in mind, just with that general statement, is one of the first books I wrote when I was at the National, I should say, was a committee report, which I wrote, but it was a committee document. But it's called Relationship Restored. And what that meant to convey is in the late 1900s and early first half of the 20th century was a wave of Chinese people who came to the United States to study. Not the 375,000 we on the next wave had, but it was probably 50 or 60,000 over decades, and they provided the basis to develop fields and area of knowledge, and Peking Union Medical College and all sorts of institutional and human infrastructure was built. And then, of course, the communists come along. There's the Cold War. There's containment. There's virtually no travel. Your passport says you can't go there. And of course, in that same period as Chinese were coming here, we had missionaries and and corporations. One of my friends, and Terry Lautz is here, our friend Halsey Beamer, he grew up in China with the Standard Oil Company, right? And James Lilly, our ambassador, had been with the Standard Oil, as I recall. You'll correct me if I'm wrong, Terry. But the point is that these people, they just don't vanish when there's a change in regime or policy. And at some point, we are going to, that how much agony, how much time, I don't know. But we're going to find we need each other. And then all of this talent, these institutions, this knowledge are going to be replugged in. So I hope the period where there's relatively little communication is short. But it's not futile, and it will be essential at some point. And also, it isn't just when we decide to move forward, but this society, and I don't mean, in a sense, social media exists in China and can be used for all of the mobilization, populist, negative politics. But there's need for voices to give a human face to this, be relentless in the search for cooperative opportunities. Now, I think that's going to be harder. This whole thing, what I've described, sort of fell into my lap. I'd be the first to concede it. I didn't create it, it just happened, and I was part of that snowball going down the hill. But I would say also the NGO sector. I've been in, well, the U.S. Army is my government experience, but NGOs and universities. The NGO sector has lots of opportunity to play a constructive role. So, and as I said, I think teaching is really a noble profession. So the opportunities are different, that whether you're trying to stop the slide going down the hill or you're trying to build up, wherever you are in the cycle, there's a role for you. So that's sort of, but I think the current stage is a little more difficult than the one I faced.
Well, I have so many questions. I hope we get to your role in the science and technology agreement, because I mean that's something that's on life support right now. But so that's one option. The other, Mike, is I alluded earlier to your 2015 speech remarks at the Carter Center inadvertently, but that was a powerful phrase, and in many ways you were really, more than many ways, you were very prescient at that time. We were aware of rumblings, but that you saw very clearly that we were at a tipping point, and I think it was in 2017 that the article in Foreign Affairs by Kurt Campbell and I always forget his name, but came out. Eli Ratner came out and sort of said our policy has been all wrong. That may have tipped the scale even farther in our U.S. policy here in Washington, at least. So either of those, but I think the latter may be on the 2015 tipping point speech. What drove you to make that speech at that time?
Well, as I always just half jokingly told my students, history's one damn thing after the next, right? So there was a sort of frame of mind, but there is actually a catalytic event that speaks to talking to people and having relations of trust. Now, I'm not naive. I mean, as I've always said, I had contracts with the CIA and lots of things that but I was always straightforward about it. with the Chinese, right? So I think I had some trusting relations, and one fed in there. I will leave the person's name out of it, but is a well-known person in the United States, in this whole U.S.-China area. And I said I was quite worried about the trends in the United States. And he says, I know, but I'm even more worried about trends in China. And went into some detail. And I said, if two intrinsic optimists really are looking at the dynamics of their respective societies and say, this isn't going the right way, there's something there. So that led me to look into it, and I spent a lot of time on that talk. But, and at the time, some people just thought I was a little over the top negative. And it could have been, and I hoped it would have been, actually. But as it turns out, things continued on this negative trajectory. I think one of the things, too, is that I felt that when the United States is not happy with itself, it's not happy with anybody else, right? And I could very clearly see the attitudinal changes. Globalization was a very disruptive phenomenon. And there were lots of, I don't mean this in a moral or normative sense, but there were a lot of people that did, or at least perceived themselves to lose in globalization. It was becoming clear in 2015 where these pockets were, and incipient and protectionism and so on. So I think, unfortunately, I happen to be right. Nobody would remember that talk if it hadn't gotten, if things hadn't moved. And I wish they hadn't moved in that direction. But in any case, it was a conversation in China that really triggered me.
So I've already asked 3 questions, so it'd be unfair if I didn't give the other 2 panelists an opportunity to ask another question each if they'd like to.
I have plenty, but we only have 45 minutes.
Okay. Carla, that's okay. So this part to be continued after.
At some point.
At some point.
Okay.
So I'd love to now open up the floor to questions. I thought we were going to have some microphones up there. We don't. So what I can do is, oh, I'm sorry. I had a senior moment. I'm sorry. There was a microphone there. So if people could just come up and I guess. That might be easier.
So there's one mic over there, is that it?
I think there's just one over there. And please also identify who you are.
Should we just have people coming here to ask questions?
Yeah.
Okay. So thank you so much, Professor Lampton, for coming here. I have to say that as someone who born in China, came to United States, want to pursue academia, not only your work, but also the effort from you and also professors and intellectuals from your generation is really the reason that why I'm here, doing the things I'm doing. So my question is related to in the book Engaging China, which is greatly edited by Professor Ann Thurston, the last chapter you wrote about the eulogy of the current state of U.S.-China relations, and pretty much pronouncing it's the current stage, the current engagement as dead. So in this case, I want to ask you, if the current stage or the previous dead stage is gone, then what do you think is going to happen for future, and what are the things for future scholars like me or Ifan or all of us who are trying to work in this field, what should we do? Thank you.
Well, I don't know what you should do because what you do should reflect what really motivates you and that's an individual decision. And also, you're in a certain environment that provides you opportunities, and some areas that probably discourage you from moving in. So that I can't say. But I do think there at any given moment of history, there is a constructive role to be played. And your job is to find the intersection between that need and your capabilities and goals. So that strikes me as the problem, right? That's not an answer. But I think I can describe the problem a little more. The subtitle of the book is From Cold War to Cold War. And the same way, almost as happened with my tipping point speech, people say, why are you saying Cold War now? Right? It seemed a year ago, a little negative to some people, or not, just a little alarmist, maybe is a better way to put it. Actually, unfortunately, every day I think it's a more appropriate, wherever you think that subtitle began, I think it is. And there are many things that lead me to say that. I think the ideological quotient of our relationship is going up, which I take to be a bad thing. And I would point just as a code to talk about Nixon and Mao. Surprisingly enough, both were ideological, but they pulled ideology out of our relationship. And now what we're talking about is autocracy versus democracy, right? So my own personal view, and this is worth a lot more discussion, is that's not a very productive way to define our relationship, even though we all understand the dimensions on which that's true. So I'd say ideology is going up. I would say I've always felt there are sort of three kinds of power: economic power, remunerative power, coercive power, military, thought coercion, and then there's cultural, diplomatic, educational realm, idea power. And I think right now, coercive power is the name of the game in our relationship. Security has taken over and once a relationship is defined as a problem for your own security, you tend to subordinate economic interests and diplomatic and cultural relations. And so now we're putting on economic export controls. And I'm not saying, incidentally, all of this is inexplicable. I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm saying it's what's happening, right? And China's doing the same thing. This is a action, reaction. And at some point, it doesn't even matter who started it. Because, just in the last 2 days, read the paper. I think this morning was about satellites and what it would mean if our space connectivity went down. And so we're investing. And if I were in a position to have to do something about that, I'd probably be reacting like this. So I'm not even asserting it's ununderstandable, but it is unfortunate. That I'm pretty sure of. Because diverting resources, increasing conflict, and so on. We don't have the opportunity to spend the time we should on global warming or international health questions. We're not cooperating on the Gaza. I mean, leaders have only so much span of control they can think about and resources. So I think the Cold War has been securitization of the relationship is the problem. And Deborah was talking about that yesterday in a lecture she gave here on China's sort of Belt and Road and connectivity development efforts around the world. Also, I often think back to, and I think you're in a better position to evaluate China if you understand your own country. Because when you see things, they actually operate in China. In many respects, they have the same problems, same solutions, or at least approximately similar solutions. So I think you have to start from the premise that there is some similarity to problem there. But what I was going to say is that Dwight David Eisenhower in 1961 gave his famous farewell address and said that basically the security industry is playing a role in U.S. society that we've never seen before. And he said, I understand it. In a way, I was part of it. But watch out, because it has endless claims on all the other aspects of our society. And here was a guy who spent his whole time in the security apparatus warning us against its tendency to take over all other priorities. And he said that's a big danger. And I think he's right. And that's what's happening in both societies. You know, I'm absolutely sure if I was a fly on the wall in the Politburo standing committee meeting, when the military says the Americans or whatever are doing X, Y, and Z, that's going to get my attention. That's my first responsibility. So that's why I think and then you can kind of look at the arms race. Our defense authorization bills have been going up 7-8%. I don't know this year what, we're maybe a little lower from the one that just got settled, but China's increasing its military budget, as far as we know publicly, by at least as much as the U.S. And you start compounding any number by 7 or 8%, and no matter where you started, it's going to be a big number before very long. So I think, you know, we are in a Cold War. The first responsibility of people is, well, what's the problem? Well, I think the problem's clear. Now, that doesn't mean it's all our fault. It doesn't mean that. China's at least half, just as a round number. But, you know, but it's a process. At some point, it doesn't matter who initiated, it matters what process, bureaucratic and popular public opinion motivate these.
So I think it's important to try to understand how it began. Is this mic on? Okay. And I'm thinking about when the United States pulled out of the environmental agreement, the Rome Agreement, and China, which had been poised to basically provide all of this infrastructure to green the world, felt, I think, that the United States was an unreliable partner. And the decision of the United States was based on a democratic process which had the legacy fossil industries playing a predominant role in the decision making. I mean, you know, drill baby drill. So what was the process on the Chinese side when you say that it was equally at fault that you see in this, as you describe it, autocratic decision-making as opposed to a democratic decision-making that caused that to happen?
You know, I don't think I quite understand the core that you're trying to get to in that question.
It's a trick question.
Well, yeah,
It's a trick question because I don't think it can be reduced to democracy and autocracy.
I thought that, well, I get now I understand why I had the problem. I think the first thing I said is, in this why I say Cold War-like circumstance, is that ideology has been reintroduced into the equation in a very unhelpful way.
What would have been a better Chinese response to this sort of unreliable partner that they saw in the United States, basically undermining this whole idea of beginning to get away from fossil fuels?
Well, first of all, it matters how you look at this. And we got Ken Lieberthal here has looked at energy and so on. And so if anyone with more knowledge wants to respond, but on just to say the coal front, it depends how you look at it. First of all, we got to start with the reality. And the reality is that China's most traditional, plentiful energy source for which it needs to depend on nobody else is coal. And they've got literally millions of people employed in that industry. And the railroads make a lot of revenue on all of it. And so you have a huge set of interests in China that are spelled coal, as you do, think of West Virginia and other Pennsylvania and so forth. So China, but that aside, China initiated a series of policies, I think it was in the 80s, mid 80s and going forward, to reduce the carbon or the coal intensity of its project, of its economy. And China is burning now much less coal than it would have had it not engaged in all those policies. So if you say, has China done anything? The answer is yes. But China's been growing so fast and all that coal's still there. So it's burning more now than it was, 15 years ago. So it's a question, how much have you done or how much do you need to do that you're not doing? Also, as China is not building coal-fired plants in China to such an extent, it's exporting them abroad. So now China's equipping Pakistan with coal-fired plants and so forth. So I guess what I would say is, and then of course now China's, I believe, the largest solar power panels maker in the world. And maybe I'm simplistic, but China is selling them to the world and subsidizing it considerably. My narrow viewpoint would be, what's wrong with China producing solar panels and selling them to the Americans below their cost of production? That seems to me actually functionally. Now, of course, if I'm an American solar power manufacturer, not so good. I understand that. But the point is, whatever China, I think China's moving in the right directions in many respects, but it does so with means that set off, trigger interest groups here, and so forth. Also, just as long as we're at it, I always try to tell students, listen to what's being said with Chinese ears. Listen to what's being said. The Americans don't like hydropower because it stops fish migration. All very reasonable. The Americans don't like nuclear power. 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl. We don't know what to do with the waste. The Americans don't like coal. But if I'm the Chinese with 10% growth and I need energy, what do the Americans like? What are they actually willing to help us do? And the answer is not much. So I think that's the way you have a productive conversation, is acknowledge the complexity. China's done some things that are good, some not so good from our viewpoint, but you're just going to have to live with it because China's 22% of the world's people, 20%.
Hey, good to see you, Mike.
Yeah, thank you.
The last Cold War saw the prevention and exchanges of scholarly exchanges and the expulsion of some of the best and brightest scholars from China, such as Chen Shisen. And now with another potential growing set of visa restrictions and harassments by institutions like U.S. Customs and Border Patrol on current Chinese scholars and students, as well as visa restrictions and other rumblings from things like Project 2025, how might universities such as Johns Hopkins and other U.S. universities and NGOs address the challenges of a potential brain drain and of China's best and brightest who might want to come and study in the United States, basically keeping engagement open amidst like a drive towards securitization? Thanks.
Yeah. Well, all good questions, and I hope at some point we can also talk about the 1979 S&T agreement and the framework of agreement between the United States and China that bear on all of this scholarly exchange and research institution exchange and so forth. So it's a very timely, and the U.S. government is in the, I would say, on the cusp. I'm not sure how close to the cusp, but probably weeks or months in deciding the next framework. The 1979 was signed when Deng Xiaoping came, and it has provided an umbrella under which many agency-to-agency agreements and educational relations have been built. And there is a big fight in this city whether to renew it at all or how to revise it. I think they're more on the how to revise it is my instinct, but I'm not sure where this will settle out. So my overall point, just to, as wind up, is this is a very contemporary, important issue that hasn't gotten much. I feel obliged as an American, but nonetheless one who's trying to be objective, to say, of course, yes, it's true, the U.S. is throwing up some barriers to some scholars, particularly from some institutions like the PLA or other security-related institutions, and in certain fields of study. That is true. You can read it in any public source. But quite frankly, that pales, absolutely pales, in front of the restrictions China has. I mean, when all is said and done, there's a little debate, but China probably still has 350,000, maybe, or 300,000 students, scholars, and so on. This also doesn't include people that come on short-term training for corporations. At one point, we had Boeing teaching or working with Chinese workers coming here, learning how to build airplanes, right? So education's even bigger than tuition-paying students at pick your favorite university. So we have I think I've talked to Ann, so I'm not, but Ann Thurston, you know, she hasn't been able to get into China for years. China doesn't announce it, it just does it. You go to the Chinese embassy and the door is either open or it's closed, but you're not going to get an explanation for why that is. So China has a really big burden here to open up. And it isn't a threat to China. I mean, it need not be construed that way. I mean, I look at myself. China early on opened itself up so I can see how it works. And when you understand it a little more, you don't forget all your own American interests, but you have a little more understanding about how to navigate all the problems. So I think China closing itself off to Western scholars is really extremely short-sighted from China's own interests, not to mention our own. So we've got 300,000 Chinese here, round numbers, and we had about 350 Americans in China. Americans are entirely appropriately seeing this as not fair, right? What do you say? Now, we're making it more difficult for American scholars ourselves because of the securitization of the relationship. Many students are afraid to go to China and be too closely associated with Chinese people, much less take scholarships, even for language study in China. Because you come back and you want to get a security clearance, and the first question is, do you know any communists? Well, the answer to that question is yes. So it's very complicated, but China is not open as it needs to be. Now, there are many impediments and always have been. Not enough Americans can speak Chinese well enough to operate in China. So that's always been a problem to greater or lesser extent. But I think, this whole question of access Now, it's true that a few people have been, relatively few people, stopped at the border. And some would describe it as interrogation. That apparently covers a wide range of activities. But being detained for hours in some cases, particularly people associated with the government and intelligence coming from China here, have been not particularly well treated. I don't mean to imply coercion. But long and the short of it is, I think you'd get a lot more receptivity from Americans if China got back to a much more open policy.
Hi, Professor Lampton. Thank you for being here with us today. A lot of the stuff that you're talking about is very relevant because I am from Canada, and a lot of the things that are happening in Canada revolves around the very same issues that China faces with the United States today. But the topic I wanted to ask you, or the question I want to ask you, really stems from this discussion I had last summer as an intern at the Simpson Center, one of the more Chatham House discussions we had regarding U.S.-China relations. And so I guess in the framework of the U.S.-China competition, what does winning look like? And if that's a wrong framework or approach to see the U.S.-China relationship, what does a successful U.S.-China relationship look like? Because something that the experts noted in the discussion is that a lot of times, especially like Foreign Secretary of State Blinken and the State Department, we've been talking about things we want to avoid happening in this relationship, miscalculations, potential war in Taiwan. But there hasn't been a lot of rhetoric or thinking in terms of what we really want to get out of this relationship, or maybe how does winning look like, or how does success look like. So I was just wondering what your thoughts are on that. Thanks so much.
Great question. And of course, the key word in the sentence is winning. I think you put it, what does winning look like? And of course, domain by domain would have different content. But as I do in the book, let me give you two anecdotes that will, I think, then fill in all the blanks I can't talk about. One of the win-win kind of projects I was involved in and write about was something that seemed rather mundane, I suppose, to most of us in most of our life. This was in 1984, 1985. And it was through the Academy of Sciences. I ran a project that involved American industry, American academic food and nutrition people out of major agriculturally oriented institutions, including Cornell University, for example. And so it was an industry, academic, and scientific researcher delegation to work with the Chinese in what was called post-harvest food loss reduction. That might sound, wow, what does that mean? Well, what it really means is at that time, China lost 50% of its fruit and vegetable between the time it was picked and the time it got to dinner table. 50%. And people, when China came out of the Cultural Revolution, nutrition was a problem in China. People were worried how to feed the Chinese people. I mean, in the late 50s, early 60s, 30, 40 million people died. So, not a minor issue. And people were talking, how do we increase food production in China with green revolution? Do we dump more fertilizer on this? Do we bring more land under cultivation? Do we chop down more forests? What do we do? And clearly the most effective answer that we thought was, why don't we start with the fact that China's wasting half the food it already produces? And so we put together an industry team with these academic researchers. And we went over and had a series of conferences, went out in the field, went to industry. We looked at their cold chain, their aseptic, they didn't have packaging virtually at all. And not just because of our little delegation, but over time, China has reduced that post-harvest food loss by at least 50% and maybe more. And now, if China's got a problem, nutritionally, generally speaking, it's obesity not lack of food, right? Now, who gained from that? We have a whole industry that does aseptic packaging, sold them equipment, materials. We had Campbell Soup Company wanted to go to China and grow vegetables for its global supply chain. China was a huge winner in this. We were. So you don't look at the whole U.S.-China relationship and say who's winning and who's losing. You got to find an area and say, let's make some winners here. And so that's what I think. Also, I was involved with the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, and we signed the health agreement with China. We had very significant progress in cancer, the etiology of cancer, because China's population doesn't move very much. I mean, relative to Americans that move every 5 years, or at least in the mid-'80s they didn't. Well, the fact that the Chinese stayed put meant that you could identify what factors in the environment are associated with higher and lower levels of cancer. Is it an environmental, is it an industrial waste that's doing it, air pollution, a million hypotheses, but China was a perfect place to study those phenomena. And so American cancer field and the Chinese cancer field, this was a marriage made in heaven. Now, there was a few problems, and that is if you're using, there's a sensitive history to Chinese feeling they're used for medical experimentation. So I'm not saying there's no problem here. But basically, this was as win-win as things get in the scientific world. So I'm saying let's not just look at this relationship as who's winning. I mean, are we winning if China has as many missiles we have as many missiles or more missiles than China? That's how the security apparatus might look at things. But there are many zones where you can have winners. And so I think it's much more gratifying to look for those. And I think, I see Bates Gill, my old friend here, and your wife's been involved with AIDS and China and so on, done great work. So that's why I said NGO space, not so bad.
Oh, thanks so much.
Yeah, bye-bye, thanks.
Thank you so much for the talk, Professor Lampton. My question is really related to the previous answer of yours. I'm a current intern at the National Committee, so it's even great to hear from you in person. I'm really excited when you said that a lot of opportunities come from the NGO field, so I definitely want to hear you elaborate further on that. Specifically, what can NGO leaders in both US and China do amid the rising tension and the changing domestic environment in China? Thank you.
Well, I have the most experience, as you suggested in your question, with the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations. I've been on their board for, 40 years. So I've got a lot of experience with that and was president of it for a while. So I ran an NGO. And I wanted to tell you, this is a little circuitous to what you answered, but I think it maybe carries an implication, and then I'll address it directly. I was president of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations when June 4th happened. And of course, people who work in NGOs work long hours for little money. That's basically, and they work because they think what they're doing is important. And suddenly June 4th happened, and here I have all these young, well-motivated people, and they're asking themselves, why are we doing what we're doing? How do you deal with people who do bad things, right? And so you've got a kind of a spiritual problem here, right? Because these are people who want to be doing good but aren't sure who they're dealing with are doing good things. And so you have to come up, you have to explain why it is you should endeavor in this direction, even though the demonstrable trend of events is very contrary. And I think the ultimate rationale has to be because you have to keep speaking the truth. And the tougher the times get, the more you need to speak the truth. And at that particular time, most of the response is, we're not going to talk to China. No more dialogue. U.S. administration, no minister level exchanges. Well, that's exactly the wrong. So I think the goal of NGOs is to be the last man standing, talking. Eventually the cycles, it may be a long time, but keep putting your hand on the scale in a productive direction. That's kind of what I see as the larger purpose. And as I mentioned in passing, the government often is our government, looking for ways to get out of corners into which they painted themselves. When the President of the United States says we're going to have no more ministers talking, secretaries and ministers talking and above, well, it's hard for him thus far to say we're changing our mind. So going back to Zhu Rongji, he was head of Shanghai. In the Chinese system, he was a minister, buzhang. But in the American system, he's a mayor. So in this moment, a mayor could come to the United States, and China could say to itself, we're sending a minister, and both sides save face. So I think there's a very creative potential to providing governments and organizations and companies ways out of corners into which they've painted themselves. I don't know if that deals a little bit with what you asked.
That's very helpful. Thank you.
Can I just jump in really quickly? Because there's a corollary of that that you capture in your book, I think really nicely. You articulated within 4 pages of each other. I'll just give the first one, but it's the same notion. It's that, it seems that we, in our righteous indignation, we often beat up on those with whom we may largely agree, because we can never get our hands on those responsible for travesties.
Yeah, right.
And I mean, I think that's a nice, that's the corollary to, what.
Right. I provide several, I think, very interesting discussions about local politicians in the U.S. meeting Chinese. One was Mayor Giuliani. I don't mean to just pile on to poor Mayor Giuliani, but I will. I brought a very progressive mayor of Shanghai, Xu Guangdi, to New York, and Shanghai and New York have a sister city relationship. So when a mayor from one city goes to the other mayor is obliged to be a polite host. And Mayor Xu Guangdi, this was, I forget, 1996? Yeah, that was 96, came. And it was Mayor Giuliani was the mayor of New York at the time. And of course, Mayor Xu, who actually had publicly rejected planning as the way to do economic work. He loved listening to Beethoven, read Western literature, was a very erudite man by any measure. And so I was responsible for taking Mayor Xu around New York, and we had indicated that he would meet with Mayor Giuliani. And we hadn't been able to get the time fixed. We thought his office had agreed to do it, but no time. And so he was there for about 3 days, and on day one, his first question is, and what about the meeting with Mayor Xu? And I said, we're still working on it. And if you go to China and meet with leaders, it's often the last minute you find out about it. So at this point, it's a little anxious inducing, but not alarming. So the next day, we get into the back seat of the limo. When am I going to meet with Mayor Giuliani? And said, we're working on it, and we were, but now it seemed like there was a problem. And we began to phone contributors to Mayor Giuliani to say, you gotta meet our guy here. And we were getting nowhere there. And finally, the third day it came back, and Mayor Giuliani's office says, we're not gonna meet with you. And of course, I'm the poor guy that has to deliver this news in the back of a limo. And he said, why? And I said, well, I can't speak for the mayor, but the way it's been explained to me is that the mayor, well, first of all, he was running for mayor the next year, so he was in election mode. But he was believe it or not, as history's evolved, it seems different now, but he ran as a law and order guy, right, at that point. And from his basic point of view is communist systems are corrupt. Therefore, leaders of communist systems are corrupt. And I don't meet with corrupt people. I realize the irony here, right? I'm just reporting to you. So in any case, and I said his brand, politicians develop brands, and his brand is law and order, and you don't fit with the program. And of course, there was still, everyone remembered June 4th and all of that, so it's not inexplicable. But a similar thing happened in California with Mayor of San Francisco. Here we had the most progressive, forward-thinking people in public life in China. And what do? We alienate the hell out of them. Now, lest this sound like an American disease, I could curl your hair what Chinese leaders have said to Americans. But we're each in the position of the people we interact are the people who really disagree with us in each society won't meet with each other. So it's really, in a sense, you have to have a certain common ground before you're meeting with people. And so we beat up in each of our systems on the people who are the most flexible. It's ironic.
So, Ifan, you have the last question.
All right. Thank you, Professor Lampton, for coming here. My name is Ifan. I'm a PhD student here at SAIS with Professor Murtha.
Lucky you.
So I want to narrow down the scope of the question to the techniques and the methodologies you use. So in your other work and this one as well, you brought up lots of conversations. And in your other book, Following the Leader, there are like hundreds of elite interviews. And I was just wondering if you could give those, us junior scholars some advice and, on doing the interviews. We know it's more than just speaking the language, right? Mm-hmm. So, how to win the trust, how to get the information we want, and also like how to tease out the information we need for our, work. And, a lot of us will be soon be on the field, and I'm excited but also nervous about that. So, any advice? Thank you.
That's a really good question. And I don't mean that I have all the answers. I just have my experience, right? And you should understand there have been many things that did not go right. So, but the first advice I got actually was from a man named Hal Saunders, who was Assistant Secretary of State, I think, for Middle East or Near East affairs, and worked on the Iran hostage crisis and Kissinger shuttle diplomacy, Camp David agreements, very successful in dealing with people. And he says the first thing in negotiation is you need to do is don't paint your interlocutor as the problem. Put the problem on one side of the desk, and you both sit on the other side, trying to solve the problem. And that gets to the second thing, and it sounds ironic. You're going to wonder what kind of person I'm in when I talk about Goldwater and conscience of a conservative and all of this. But I had a meeting in I don't mean me, I went to a meeting, a small meeting in the Roosevelt Room at the White House with President Reagan, who had invited some Chinese students over. And of course, Reagan had talked about the evil empire, in this case talking about, and Gorbachev tear down this wall, but he was a staunch anti-communist. I talk a lot about that. But he was going to China in 1984 and called our office and asked us to bring 12 Chinese students over so he could talk to them. And in the days building up to it, one of my friends was on the White House staff, said that President Reagan was really excited about meeting with all these Chinese students. He remembers that, there was the Boxer Rebellion. There were, yes, that there were these, the reparations. But the U.S. didn't keep the reparations. We provided them for fellowships and educational institution building. And he thought that was great and a great way to open up to talk to the Chinese students. And one of his aides kept saying, no, the Boxer Rebellion's a little sensitive. Hunminganda Wenti, right? And there were reparations, and there was the 8-power expeditionary force, and it's kind of sensitive. And he said, yeah. And the next day, he went through the same thing with the same staff member. And so, fast forward, the meeting happens, and Reagan walks in. And it was an imposing man. And he said, we've always liked Chinese students. We had the Boxer Rebellion, and he went through the history. And, of course, people like me that are always expecting some problem and not wanting to offend unnecessarily, were a little skeptical how that was going to play. And all of the Chinese students could talk about Tada Jingsheng. How? Right? His spirit was great. His taidu, his attitude. They looked at the spirit of what was being conveyed, not the details. And I think to effectively communicate, you need to understand what are the underlying motivations of people. And as long as you can establish that what I'm saying I believe to be true, but I'll listen to what you got to say. So I think the interviewing and negotiating are not entirely separable activities. And that ultimately it depends on trust. That's why to have only 350 American students in China is a disaster, because you're not establishing these relationships. Right? I mean, in Chinese language class, practically the first thing an American learns starting in Chinese is guanxi. What is guanxi? Why is it important? Right? So I think that there are many ways to build trust, but put the problem on one side and you sit with your friend, your colleague, your interlocutor on the other side. And then also, don't try to be more Chinese than Chinese. Be American. Yeah, we have faults, but sincerity is a big word. I don't know, does that even address your question?
For the record, she gave 2 thumbs up. So I think we're just at time. So there, like I said, there are books in the back for sale. Mike, I have you in writing saying that you were going to sign them. So
Well, if it's in writing.
And then we also have a reception in the next room. And I just want to thank. I want to thank all of you for being here. I want to thank Carla and David for filling out the panel. And most of all, I want to thank thank you, Mike, for sharing this with, I mean, this book really is a gift to all of us. So thanks so much.
Thank you for